The engine of TTRPGs. The command center of Dungeons & Dragons. The shiny math rock. It's the D20. If you're watching this, you probably own more than you can roll. Maybe you even have a tattoo of one. But where did the beloved icosahedron come from? Let's find out. These things are how the first games ever were played. Quite literally, they were the first gaming tools on the planet. Dice had been found in archaeological digs dating all the way back to 2000 BC, and we call them knuckle bones for a reason. The first ever dice were fashioned out of literal knuckle bones of animals, not people. Though I'm sure there were a few badasses rocking ones made from the bones of their enemies. While knuckle bones are a whole lot cooler, they're practically the same as the six-sided dice of today. The earliest writings on dice are in the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. My wife is actually from South India, and the Mahabharata is her favorite story ever, so I asked her to tell me about the dice of it all. And Weird barely begins to cover it. It's amazing, so strap in. This particular story centers on two opposing sets of cousins. The king and his 99 brothers, all the sons of a blind king and a vengeful queen, and some magic involving 100 pots. They're the bad guys. On the other side, 5 brothers, the children of gods and women who were married to a man who was cursed to die if he ever had an orgasm. Those are the good guys. I did tell you this was weird. So this bad guy king really hates the good guys. Childhood jealousy, plus the fact that these guys are borderline superheroes because of all the god blood. The king is very close to his uncle, who is one of the coolest characters I've ever heard of. We'll get to why. For now, all you need to know is that uncle is great at the game of dice. He always uses the same set. And if he thinks of a number, the dice will roll that number. He's a literal dice wizard, baby. When the king challenges the good guys to a game that they can't refuse, he taps out and subs in Uncle Dice Wizard. At first, the good guys are winning, so they get cocky and start wagering bigger and bigger stuff. Eventually, the eldest bets basically everything they own, including the wife that all 5 of the good guy brothers share. Yeah, that's a thing, by the way. So anyway, they lose because Uncle is a literal dice wizard, and that was the play all along. Then the shared wife gets an infinite sorry from Krishna when the king tries to disrobe her in front of everybody. Thanks, Krishna. Then the king banishes the good guys out to the forest. But the king didn't know he was getting straight up played by Uncle Dice Wizard. He hates this entire family, the good guys and the bad. When Uncle Dice Wizard was a kid, his sister was kidnapped and forced to marry the blind king. Remember the blind king, the dad of the bad guys? There's a lot of people in this, I'm sorry. Then baby Uncle Dice Wizard and the rest of his family are imprisoned and tortured for a very, very long time. Everyone except for baby Uncle Dice Wizard died. So he took their bones and fashioned a set of dice from them. The dice that he always plays with. That's why they listen to him. The bones of his starved family are hungry for revenge. He essentially manipulated the king and fixed that dice game to start a war between the cousins as revenge for the sins of their family. Isn't that the most metal thing you've ever heard? That is the first record of dice on the planet. Insane. The oldest D20 we think we found dates back to 300 BC. It's called the Ptolemaic dice, and it was unearthed in Egypt in 1980, right in the era of satanic panic, so sure that didn't help. It's covered in Greek letters, and it's made from serpentinite. Cool. They found the demon game thingy in Egypt covered in strange symbols and made from snake rock. Yeah. Definitely didn't help D&D's case. A bunch of other ancient ones have been found, and most of them are attributed to the Romans. The Louvre has a beautiful glass one that's covered in Latin letters and Roman numerals. So they've been around almost always, but we still have no idea what games the ancients used these things for. Maybe all of the various pantheons were just ancient TTRPG sessions. Who knows? But they lived on in obscurity for nearly 2 millennia. After World War II, Japan went through a long series of rebuilding and revitalization projects. The Japanese Standards Association was formed to administrate all of that. They had to take a ton of random sample selections for all of their quality control efforts. To do this, they first started using complex randomization tables. But that was hard and weird, so they built what was pretty much a Price is Right wheel with 1 through 10 on it. Then they threw around a few more weird schemes before eventually realizing the D20 was the way to go. So the very first mass production of D20s began. They called it the icosahedron back then, and they treated it like a scientific instrument for advertising and sales. At the time, it cost around 2,500 yen for a set of 3. That was almost $18 US at the time, which is somewhere in the area of $217 today. That's half of my grocery bill for the entire month. You can get these things for change out of gumball machines today. But the icosahedron wasn't a toy to the JSA, it was a serious tool to be invested in. Demand for these things started growing throughout all of the scientific communities of the world, so the JSA started taking it on tour to drum up global interest. But there's no way they could predict where their little device would go. Now, wargaming goes all the way back to Sun Tzu and Go, but it wasn't until Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig, what a name, invented his own wargame that wargaming proper began to take shape. The first edition was released in 1780 under a long German name that translates to attempt to build upon chess, a tactical game for which 2 or more persons might play. At least it was descriptive. Building on the basis of chess, Hellwig added terrain types like mountains, swamps, and water, plus 50 new pieces, and 1,553 squares to the board. Pretty minor patch, really. In 1803, he refined it further and dubbed it Das Kriegsspiel, which means the war game. I prefer the old name. From there, war games entered into a long history of use in military training operations and strategic battle plans around the world. But I was in the Coast Guard, so I'm gonna sit that one out. The stateside commercial side is what we're here for. Playing games like Kriegsspiel for laughs stayed in the obscure side of gaming until 1913, when another game was invented with the absolute kindest of intentions by none other than H.G. Wells. He's known for writing some cool stuff, I guess. But despite being the author of War of the Worlds, he was actually a pacifist. His game was called Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years to 150. And for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes games and books. He meant well by that last part, but come on. He wanted to make something fun that would give people, but mostly boys, an outlet for their aggression. His game involved soldier miniatures that shot actual tiny bullets at each other from mini cannons. He wanted actual things to happen. He didn't really like the numbers of it all. But until Little Wars, wargaming was an extremely expensive hobby that was only available to the rich and those in the military. H.G. Wells single-handedly made them accessible to everyone. He fucking rules for that. Up until the 1970s, the D20 remained an obscure and rare part of the gaming world. Until Lou Zocchi, I think that's how you say it. Zocchi. You'd think I'd be better at last names. Until Lou Zocchi started importing them to the UK. Zocchi loved dice. He even famously invented the Zocchihedron. It's a 100-sided dice that's also known as Zocchi's golf ball, because it looks like a golf ball. He opened the door for D20s to enter the wargaming community. And the very first wargame to be published that featured a D20 was called Tractics. It was created by Mike Reese and Leon Tucker in 1971, and it featured illustrations by Don Lowry. The fingerprints of what to come are all over this thing. Mike and Leon really cared about accurate simulation, so they had all sorts of familiar statistics like armor, movement speed, and rate of fire, but for a ton of actual real-life tanks, they gave shots from tanks a 30% chance of hitting, which they used the D20 to calculate. Anything above 15 was considered a success. But because it was such an expansive game of miniatures, I added all the syllables. It required an impartial judge to help keep track of it all. It's not hard to see how that could inspire the idea of the Dungeon Master. And it's also really convenient that there's one other man with credited contributions to Tractics, Gary Gygax. We'll get back to 1971 in a second here, but we gotta get a little bit of context on good old Gary. He's obviously the key person in this whole video. His real name was Ernest, but he went by his middle name, which was a tribute to Gary Cooper by his mother. He grew up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and learned to love fantasy, sci-fi, and games in his youth. It's a nerdy tale as old as time. His childhood friend group, the self-named Kenmore Pirates, would all play games together, and they even LARPed before LARPing was a thing. Basically just make pretend stuff with swords like the kids do. But in 1953, Gary and his best friend Don Hay started getting really into wargaming. They made their own rules and miniatures. I like having all the syllables, I'll keep them. And they just straight up used firecrackers for bombs and stuff. I say we bring that back. Sure, it would ruin all the hard hours that the DM put into painting the terrain and figures, but think about how cool it will be for that 1 second. Gary joined the Marines for a hot minute, so he's a veteran, but he got discharged for walking pneumonia. After that, he just kept his war to the gaming. His obsession with these things ran deep. Famously, when his wife was pregnant with baby number 2, she suspected him of having an affair because he was gone so much. She went over to the friend's house to confront him and found him and his friends sitting around a massive array of miniatures. This feels somehow more embarrassing than actually having an affair. You neglect your wife and children for that? Okay. Gary floated around from job to job, but his real passion was writing war games. In 1967, he threw a little 20-person gaming event called Gen Con. Yeah, it's that Gen Con. Or at least it became that Gen Con anyway. It was at one of those first meetings that Gary met his D&D co-creator, Dan Arneson. But forget about Dan for a while. We're just doing this whole story in order. It's called an arc, people. Come on. In 1970, Gary headquartered the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association in his basement with his friends. among whom were the Tractics co-creators Mike Reese and Leon Tucker. They were friends the whole time, oh my god. He also founded the Castle and Crusade Society later that year with his other friend Robert Kuntz. He was really digging deep into this world, which probably contributed to him losing his job. He still had a wife and 5 kids to take care of, so the pressure was on. He tried selling board games that he designed for a while. That didn't go super well. Then he started cobbling shoes in his basement, which also doesn't sound like it would work too well, but he made enough of a living and had enough free time that he could work on game development more. He started doing editing work for Guidon Games, who mostly published war games. I'm sure it was a dream come true for old Ernest. You forgot that was his name, didn't you? Now we're right back to 1971. His buddies have just published Tractics. The D20 has entered the playing field. It's circling his orbit. In that same year, Gary published his own game with fantasy and magic elements called, you guessed it, Chainmail. Gotcha. We're still not there yet. While it wasn't yet the fantasy giant we know today, it was almost there. It didn't even originally use the D20. It was a man-to-man combat simulator that was heavily inspired by Tolkien, and it used a pair of D6s to determine its outcomes. It did fairly well for a small-time publisher, but it had yet to break through the nerdy mainstream. It's clear enough what the secret sauce was then. It's the shiny math rock we all know and love. That and Dan Arneson. Remember him? He had developed a fantasy setting that is now known as Blackmore, and he briefly used Chainmail as the rules system for it. Around 1972, he went to Gen Con, thoroughly excited to show Gary his game, and obviously, that went pretty well. So the two of them began collaborating on a little fantasy role-playing game. Yes, that's right. It's the game that we now know as the fantasy game. Got you again. But it did become Dungeons & Dragons by the time it was published in 1974, so we were both right. Yay, we did it. But the D20 was only a small part of the original game. It was used for attack and saving rolls, but it still depended on sets of D6 for almost everything. The D20 was still pretty rare at the time, so it makes sense that they didn't rely on it too heavily. It wasn't even until the 1978 D&D sourcebook, In Search of the Unknown, came out that the term D20 was first used. The dice weren't even numbered 1 through 20 like they are now, and Gary himself recommended adding some scribbles of your own to fix that. But the D20 got more and more use through all subsequent D&D updates and satanic panics, but it took all the way until the year 2000 for Wizards of the Coast to officially adopt the D20 system in D&D 3rd edition. This is the version of the game that allowed it to enter the mainstream. Well, the nerdy mainstream anyway. We're all whining about the 2024 updates. There are still people who prefer to play 3.5 over 5e. That's deep level love of the game right there. And that's the weird story of how the D20 became the standardized symbol of D&D and the TTRPG community. I did not expect this level of weird when I started researching, and yet, here we are. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that, and let me know what other weird geekery you want me to do a deep dive on. But you'll have to roll a persuasion check, or intimidation if that's your thing. Peace.